At long last, we're finally down to the last video on public opinion. I told you this was my area of research and I love talking about it, and you're going to get a little more of this when I talk about public opinion, so I'm not going to apologize. I love talking about this stuff, and I hope you guys find it interesting. In the last video, I want to talk about potential sources of uncertainty in public opinion polls, and I'm purposely calling them potential sources of uncertainty because one of the things that political scientists try and do is reduce the kind of uncertainty that we can reduce. Some things can't be eliminated, right? Since we're doing estimates of public opinion based on random samples, we can't get rid of those kind of uncertainties. But there are other kinds of uncertainties that we can try and reduce. We can't really get rid of them all, but we can do our best to reduce them. And so I'm going to talk about two particular kinds of uncertainty in public opinion polls that political scientists and the people who conduct polls are constantly trying to figure out the best way to do this. The first one has to do with the way questions are worded. I refer to these as question wording effects. The idea is this, that differences in the way that questions are worded can affect how people respond. Now, I'm not talking about polls that purposely try and ask questions in a way that lean someone to answer one direction or the other. As I've said in previous videos, the people who do that, they're not trying to estimate public opinion. Those people are trying to shape public opinion. Organizations like the Pew Research Center, organizations like Gallup, they're trying to estimate public opinion, but people are complicated. And some of the issues that they ask about are complicated as well. And so here's an example of a question that was asked in 2005. I know it was a long time ago, but I think it's a particularly good example. In this question, in this survey, they were asking people what they thought about euthanasia. I'm not talking about young people who live on the Asian continent. I'm talking about euthanasia, the process by which people who are terminally ill can take their own lives. This is legal in some states, not legal in other states. So that's what I mean by euthanasia. And as you'll notice in the survey questions they don't ask about euthanasia because that would be a complicated term that most people wouldn't understand. So what the Pew Research Center did is they did a random sample, and they asked half of their people, respondents they're called, half the people in the survey, one form of a question, and then they asked the other half a different form of a question. And what I'm going to suggest to you is that the questions are basically the same question. In the first group of people who were randomly selected, and they got the first version of the question, they asked whether they favored making it legal for doctors to give terminally ill patients the means to end their lives. In this group, 51% said they favored that, making it legal for doctors to give terminally ill patients the means to end their lives. The other group was asked whether they favored making it legal for doctors to assist terminally ill patients in committing suicide. When they asked the question that way, only 44% said that they favored that. Now, it's probably not hard to figure out why fewer people supported the second version of the question than the first version of the question. The term suicide has all kinds of negative connotations to it. When you're talking to people, they may know somebody who recently committed suicide. They may have lost a loved one to suicide. They may have felt suicidal in their life or recently, and all of that might affect how they respond to those questions. But the point I want to make is that both of those questions are fully legitimate questions. There's nothing wrong with the second way that it's phrased. Because when you're talking about euthanasia, you are talking about people taking their lives. You are talking about suicide. And so if you only ask it the first way, one could say, hey, look, you're asking in a way that's going to increase the likelihood that people are going to answer it favorably. Other people would say, well, if they ask it the second way, you're going to increase the likelihood that people are going to respond unfavorably. And that's exactly what people conducting public opinion polls do. What they try and do is they try and ask multiple questions about the same topic. In other words, instead of relying on the first version or the second version to estimate what the public thinks, they'll ask one question phrased one way, another question phrased a different way, a third question phrased another way, a fourth question phrased a different way, and they'll take all of those responses and use that to create an idea of how people feel about the topic. Now, you know what the memory-based model is at this point. How does asking multiple questions help give a more reliable answer? Well, the first time they ask the question, let's say the first version, people are going to randomly sample a certain set of attitudes they have stored in memory. When they ask the second version, people are going to do another random sample, but it might be different. It might sample different attitudes about this topic. If they ask a third version and then a fourth version, they'll take a third and a fourth random sample of attitudes. By the time you've asked people to do 4 random samples of their attitudes, you're going to have a much bigger, sort of fuller idea of all the attitudes they have stored in memory on this particular topic. And so the way to avoid question wording effects is to ask multiple questions about the same topic. Now, sometimes students get confused about this because they think that pollsters are purposely trying to make people respond one way or another. But as I'm explaining here, if the people conducting public opinion polls are trying to solve the problem of question wording effects, then they must not be purposely trying to trick people. So don't include that in your answer if you get this question. They're not trying to trick people, but they know that the way the questions are worded can affect how people respond. So the way that they get around asking just one question is to ask multiple questions about a topic and get a fuller idea of what people think. Another example of uncertainty in public opinion polls has to do with what are called question order effects. What do I mean by that? It turns out that the order in which questions are asked can also affect responses. So let me give you what I find to be a fascinating example. There are 2 kinds of questions that we ask in public opinion polls: political knowledge questions and then attention to the news questions. The political knowledge questions are asked to try and determine whether somebody is politically sophisticated or a political novice. And so right now you can get a little test for yourself as to whether or not you know the answers to these questions. So they'll ask questions like, what are the first 10 amendments to the Constitution called? Which party has a majority in the House of Representatives? Who was vice president when Bill Clinton was president? How many votes does it take to override a presidential veto? They'll ask a series of neutral questions and then take a score, and the people who score highest are considered political sophisticates. The people who score lowest are considered political novices. And this is a standard thing that we use in public opinion polls. This idea of politically neutral questions was actually something that was created by one of the people I studied under at UCLA. We also like to ask questions about how much people pay attention to the news. But one of the things that we found in survey questions is people kind of lie about how much attention they pay to the news sometimes. And so over the years, they've decided that the best way to ask this is, instead of how much attention do you pay to the news, people are always going to say they watch more than they actually do. They'll ask In the past week, how many days did you read, watch, or listen to some form of news? Or in the past week, how many days did you get news from? And then they'll name a number of sources: CNN, Fox, MSNBC, the Wall Street Journal, local news, things like that. So that's what I mean by attention to the news questions. Well, it turns out that there's a question order effect when you ask political knowledge questions in the same survey that you ask questions about attention to the news. Now, why? These have nothing to do with one another, right? Well, if you ask the attention to the news questions, followed by the political knowledge questions, people will do what I already said. When you ask how much news do you watch, people will lie and overstate how much news they watch. I mean, it's kind of silly in a way, but people want to make it sound like they're good citizens, that they're doing their job. And so, yeah, I pay attention. I watch 5 days a week or 6 days a week. So we try and ask questions in a way that people are going to tell the truth, but they don't. So if you ask the attention to the news questions first, followed by the political knowledge questions afterwards, people will overstate how much news they watch. If the political knowledge questions come first, and then after they ask the political knowledge questions, they ask the attention to the news questions, what do you think people do? If you said that they understate how much news they watch, you're correct. Because, truth be told, most people don't know the answers to these politically neutral questions. And so they don't want to be asked a bunch of political knowledge questions and say, I don't know, or worse, get it wrong. And then when the pollster follows it up with how often do you watch the news, then it's like, they don't want to say I watch it all the time, because it's like, yeah, I watch it all the time. I'm just an idiot and I don't remember anything. So what do you do to get around this problem, that there's a question order effect? Well, the first thing we do is that when we know that there are particular kinds of questions affect how people respond, we put them at far ends of the survey. We make sure that they're away from one another. Sometimes we'll have the attention to the news questions first. Sometimes we'll have the political knowledge questions at the very end, or sometimes we'll switch them and have the political knowledge questions at the very beginning and the attention to the news questions at the very end. And then sometimes what we'll do is just change them, the random order of them, and hope that by asking them in different places randomly throughout the survey, we wind up getting a most accurate sort of estimate of how often people actually watch the news. People can't lie about their political knowledge, but they can lie about their attention to the news. So by randomizing the order of the questions, we hope at least to come close to the truth. Political order, question order effects, question wording effects. Now, just as a one quick reminder, hopefully you're still watching. Every once in a while, students will get these questions, and they'll get a question on the essay that asks about question wording effects, and they'll write down their answer to the question order effects, or vice versa. Make sure you read your exam carefully and you know which question you have. So if you've written out a good answer to the question order effects and a good answer to the question wording effects, make sure you paste the right one in to your exam. And that ends the extensive public opinion lecture. Okay, I hope you found this interesting. Hopefully I'll hear from you on the discussion board.